Welcome, everyone, to our ongoing classes on the 7 divine universal commandments for all of mankind, known as the 7 Noahide laws. We are coming towards the end of this book, the text that we're using, the theory and practice of universal ethics, the Noahide laws, by Rabbi Dr. Shimon Dovid Cowen of Australia. We're in part 2 of the book. We are in the middle of chapter 12, section E. That would be page 340. Regard for others and their property. And we only have a few more classes left in this book, and then we will have to make a decision, an executive decision, as far as to what we will be studying afterwards. Very exciting. Took us quite a while, and we probably understood some of what we've read over here, so that's always very nice. And let us begin. Page 340, right in the middle, E, regard for others and their property. As noted, basic theft involves taking something from the possession of another without the other's consent. That's basically what it is. You can't call it borrowing if you borrow without the person's permission. That is technically stealing, theft. There are circumstances where consent is given by the other, and yet advantage is taken from him or her. The action is not really stealing. In other words, when you take it, you're not stealing because you have permission. But then when you misuse or abuse the item that you took, that then becomes a form of stealing. One does not regard the disadvantage of the other as one would one's own, because there is no palpable theft or injury. Such actions may not all appear to be outright wrongs. Still, inasmuch as, and to the extent that, they negate the concepts of community, society must find ways to forbid these things, if not ideally to eliminate them. So you have to find a way to control them. Exploitation. There are circumstances where a price is paid for an item which unreasonably exceeds its value. Price is established by supply and demand, but this mechanism does not always operate freely and competitively. In the words of a classic commentator, there may be consent on the part of the purchaser to pay an exorbitant price, since this is the way of buying and selling, where there are people who need an item and are willing to buy it for more than its value. In a situation where the market is not competitive, the need of a person can be exploited to yield an excessively high price. Exploitation can also be directed against the supplier-producer through a monopolistic middleman or retailer buyer who underpays for the produce. Exploitation on the side of the supplier is frequently called price gouging or price hiking. A fair price established through competition provides everyone, buyer and seller, with a living. An unfair price established by non-competitive behavior cuts into the living of one or the other side, not because of deception, but because of need. In Jewish law, when the competitive price is exceeded by more than 1/6, there obtains what is legally termed a relationship of exploitation, and the sale is void, and the money and the goods must be returned. Often, an exorbitant or an insufficient price might be charged because of ignorance on the part of vendor or buyer of availability of the goods at the competitive price. Where, however, the vendor or buyer makes known that he or she is charging above or paying less than the market price, and the other side agrees to go ahead with that price, there is no exploitation. All right, so basically, I'll start with the last thing we just said. Everything that we're going to discuss that is not allowed, both from the buyer or the seller's end, is only if they're unaware and if they don't agree. If you have the agreement, then there's no problem and there's no such thing as underpaying or overcharging. Because if they both agree to do so, then none of the rules apply. Because as long as both parties are in agreement, that's fine. And why would you agree to pay so much? That's your business. Or why would the seller agree to sell it for so little? That's his business. Just as one can give it as a free gift, one can take it for free as a gift, receive it, one can give it as a gift. So too, if you decide to charge a minimal amount or less than that, that's fine if the person is willing to sell it for that price. And same thing vice versa, to pay a tremendous amount. It only applies when there is ignorance on either part or there's a lack of knowledge and they don't know that this is really the market value or what its true value is. Then we have rules where you cannot overcharge and you cannot underpay. Even though the person says, this is what I'm charging you. If he's unaware that it's worth much more or much less, whichever end we're talking about, then you can't do that. According to the first opinion, exploitation is not included in the Noachide law of theft. So in other words, if someone does this, so to say, dishonest overcharging, that's not called stealing. On the other hand, the second opinion does include it in the extended category of theft. Whilst as mentioned, the baseline position is that of the first opinion, as he says over and over again, that that's what we really follow, which means to say that it technically would not be called theft. We find that modern consumer protection and antitrust law reflects a trend towards amelioration of features of exploitation. At the same time, the way this is treated is different to Jewish law, so that the first opinion operates in its own way to negate exploitation. Were the second opinion to be taken on by society in its entirety, it would follow the same counters as the Jewish law. So again, being consistent with everything we've been learning until now, if you were to take the second opinion, so that means you actually would apply exactly what the Jewish law is, and that's very clear, as I say many times, that as far as Jewish law is concerned, it's very black and white, it's very, very clear what's forbidden, what's permitted. So if we were to take that approach and we were to apply it to Noachites, then we know exactly the amount, 1/6, etc. However, we don't take that approach, and therefore, you really have to go with what the society is accepting at that time, and in that locale, what is acceptable and what is not. So it's not the same as it is for Jews. So if a Jew is selling something to a fellow Jew, different rules apply. We're talking over here Noachite, one non-Jew to another non-Jew, or for that matter, if a Jew is selling to a Noachite. Even to a law-abiding Noachite who accepted upon himself to keep the 7 mitzvahs, still the rules would apply as they do to a Noachite, not to a fellow Jew. Interest. All right. Borrowing, lending money, and charging for it. That's very normal in society, and it makes a lot of sense. Paying and charging interest, whereby an individual pays back more than he or she has borrowed, is something freely and knowingly contracted. Okay, it's self-understood, and everybody agrees to it, and it makes sense. Because if you borrow $1,000 from someone for, let's say, 30 days, well, that person didn't have those $1,000 of his, and therefore you're using something of theirs. It's look at it sort of like renting their money. So now you pay for it. So you give them back 1,000 plus. Makes sense. It is the rental of money. At the same time, it differs from other kinds of rentals, since it is something which eats at or bites a person in a way which is more insidious and unconscious. In the words of one traditional commentator, it consumes the wealth of one's fellow without his or her being aware until one finds one's home empty. The novelty of the Jewish law prohibiting the taking of interest from a fellow Jew, vis-a-vis the prohibition of exploitation, overcharging or underpaying, is that it cannot be foregone. Meaning, one cannot waive one's entitlements and agree to pay or receive interest. The only way this prohibition can be circumvented is by forming a joint venture between borrower and lender over the loan with a sharing of profits. Okay, that's known as a heter iska, as he mentions in 93, which is a little bit complicated. Not really, but it's got to be done right. So let me explain. Imagine this is sort of one of those riddles or mind games that they tell, especially children. If someone says they're going to charge you 1 penny on the first day, and after that, you pay double every day. Second day, you pay 2 pennies. The next day, 4. The next day, 8. For 30 days. Would you be willing to do that? Or that would be the interest. You borrow money for 30 days, or for as long as you want, and first day, you owe me, you borrowed $1, owe me $1 and a penny. Second day, $1, 2 pennies, $1, and so on. And it keeps doubling. You don't realize until you actually do the math, it's almost counterintuitive as to how astronomical it becomes so fast. So interest in general that's what we're referring to. It's in the Torah. It's called, one of the terms that it's called is neshech, which is the same root, same meaning as to bite, as he just mentioned over here, that it eats at or bites. And people out of desperation borrow money and they're going to pay interest. But as many people know, when you take a loan from the bank or whatever, and you have to pay interest, it destroys people financially. So a Jew from a Jew, very clear, no question about it. It's a big sin. It's a big prohibition for a Jew to charge interest. And not only that, it's a separate prohibition. There's 365 negative commandments in the Torah for the Jew. One of them is you mustn't charge interest as the lender. A separate one of the 365 is you mustn't pay interest as the borrower. You cannot say, it's not my fault, I need the money, he's charging me interest. I'm at his mercy. He's the sinner. I'm just paying my debt. No, you're not allowed to agree to such a loan, and you're not allowed to pay interest. And then there's a third separate prohibition of the 365, that you're not allowed to be involved in any way, shape, or form in that loan. You cannot be a guarantor. You cannot be a witness. You cannot be the scribe that's writing or printing that contract. That's a separate prohibition. So when it comes to from a Jew to a Jew, it's very, very strict that a Jew may not charge interest and the Jew may not pay interest. And there is, as he just mentioned at the end, there is a way to do it that there's and it's a special document that the two of them agree to, and then they sign it. And basically, what it is, as he says, we're forming a joint venture, and they share the profits. So it's sort of an investment that they both made, and then the profits are what one guy gets. It's not considered interest from the person who borrowed. It's a little complicated, but it is a loophole, and it is 100% legal if done right. According to the first and basic view, there is no prohibition in charging or paying interest under Noachide law. For the second view, it would seem to be included in the extended prohibition of theft, since more than the value of the money is taken in return. Okay, we'll finish the paragraph and then we'll see this footnote 94. According to the first view, the concept of regard for others involved in the concern of Scripture about taking interest must have to do with mitigating excessive interest and destructive debt accumulation. The moral import of this, according to the baseline view, should be at least to seek to help individuals against accumulation of interest compounded debt and to make low interest loans. In other words, common sense. Interest, fine, but it should not get out of hand, and it should not cause people to, lose everything. Now, it's interesting to note that there is a mitzvah, one of the 248 positive commandments for the Jew, that when he lends money to a non-Jew, to a Gentile, he is to charge interest. Okay? Now that seems unfair. So the way I explain it is, on the contrary. Objectively speaking, is charging interest a correct thing, a moral thing, or not? And I would say absolutely. Again, you're renting the person's money. I gave you a certain amount of money, and during that period of time, I don't have access to that money. Whether or not I need it at the time, I don't have it. So you're using it. So you pay for the usage. It's no different than renting a tool or renting a house or renting anything. Not everything is borrowed. So borrowing money with interest, don't call it borrowing, call it renting the money. Fine, makes sense. The Torah is telling that in the interaction between one Jew and the other, it's forbidden to charge interest because you're going above and beyond the norm, above and beyond the rational approach. And the Torah demands that of every Jew within another Jew. For example, you own a store, a grocery store, let's say. Someone comes in. You're not going to overcharge them. Everything is priced a proper price where you make a certain amount of a profit. Now, are you allowed to undercharge certain individuals by choice? It may seem unfair if it's one person after the other and one person you charge this, that person you charge that. It's like almost like you're making it up. No, it's all listed. Everything is marked. There's a price, and you're not overcharging. But certain people, as they come by to pay at the cashier, you say, "Oh, give that person a 50% discount." What? That's unfair. That person may be your brother, may be your sister, may be your best friend. Just as the storekeeper has a right to say, don't charge that person. They just came in, they bought $100 worth of groceries, give it to them for free. You know that they're having trouble financially, or that person did you a great favor. You have a right. It's your store. You have a right to give things away for free. Likewise, you have a right to undercharge them or to not make a profit and charge them exactly the amount that it cost you. And you're making zero profit and you're losing nothing. You have a right to do that. So that is what the Torah is demanding of every Jew within the Jewish community. Any Jew, I don't care if you are his friend, neighbor, know him, like him, doesn't matter. A Jew cannot charge interest from another Jew. But charging interest from a non-Jew as long as you're not exploiting them or whatever, is normal, is acceptable. And now why? So then why then is it a mitzvah? Why then am I supposed to charge interest? So one of the explanations given is because we want to avoid too much interaction. Or likewise, if a Jew pays interest to the non-Jew, so we don't want too much involvement there, so he's going to be discouraged from borrowing from a non-Jew, so he'll borrow from a Jew, because we want that the Jewish people, first and foremost, would take care of themselves, such as when it comes to charity. So first the Jew has to give charity to the Jew, and then he gives charity to the non-Jew, as is the order. First comes relatives, then comes the poor people of your city, and so on. There's an order of precedence. At any rate, charging interest for Bnei Noyach from another Ben Noyach. According to what we're saying over here, we're not taking the approach that all the rules apply as they do to a Jew. Would not be a problem, but again, you just have to be careful not to overdo it so that the person ends up losing everything. Okay, let's see footnote 94, bottom of page 343. The Ramban, that's Nachmanides, not to be confused with Maimonides. The Ramban, in his commentary on the Torah, includes, within Noachide civil law, the Jewish laws of loans, inasmuch as one side takes more than the value of the money borrowed, though voluntarily given, there is an aspect of theft involved. So he says a non-Jew cannot take interest from another non-Jew. This is also a view of one of the explanations in Tosafos, in Tractate Bava Metzia. Okay. Sefer HaMitzvahs Hashem, which is what we were actually discussing, whether we should use this book after we finish this book. So Sefer Mitzvahs Hashem, page 452. Based on the Sefer HaChinuch, Mitzvah 416, learns that just as coveting is included in theft, since it is associated with, it can lead to theft. So also taking interest is included because of its association with theft, taking more than was owed. Yeah. Yeah. So over there he brings down that first he says, we don't find that there's a prohibition of interest by non-Jews. We don't find that. Then he says, however, in this commentary of Tosafos in Bava Metzia, in one of their explanations there, they do say that Ben Noyach is commanded not to take interest because it's like stealing. However, the other explanation there in the Tosfos, he does say that Noachites are not commanded about not taking interest. And therefore, this prohibition, he concludes there, does not apply to Noachites. According to this view, that it does apply, there is no contradiction with the permission given to Jews to charge interest to non-Jews, or to non-Jews to charge interest to Jews, since as the responsa Avnei Nezer learns, the expression of your brother, as used in the prohibition of interest, can refer to the internal community of Jews and the internal community of non-Jews, as distinct relations between the distinct communities. In other words, Jews and Jews are for sure called your brother. And you can say that all non-Jews with Other non-Jews, even if it's a different nation, they're all called your brothers. The only ones that you surely can't call your brother is a Jew and a non-Jew, or a non-Jew and a Jew. So therefore, even according to this other opinion that we're not following, and you are allowed to charge interest, but even, let's say for argument's sake, even if you want to follow the opinion that says that non-Jews are not allowed to charge non-Jews interest, that it does apply to them, but surely they're still allowed to charge Jews interest, and Jews are allowed to charge them interest because it says your brother. So that's undisputed. Everybody agrees that a Jew can charge a non-Jew interest, or should, and a non-Jew can charge a Jew interest. All right. That's what we spoke about as far as interest is concerned. And bottom line, non-Jews can charge Jews interest, and la halacha, according to the bottom line, the ruling is non-Jews can charge non-Jews interest. However, it makes sense to say that you shouldn't overdo it, and the person should not suffer more than just whatever he's paying for, the usage of the money. Now we move on to the next thing. Page 344, return of lost property. This is, again, a very famous mitzvah for the Jew. The term in the Talmudic terminology is called hashavas aveda, which means the returning of something lost. And there's many, many details about that, how and when the Jew needs to return it, a lot of details. How you know whose it is, are you obligated to try to seek out whose it is, in what cases may the person keep it, and so forth. Exploitation and usury are negative aspects of regard for others, forms of conduct not to be pursued or to be minimized. In the precept incumbent upon the Jewish people of returning lost property to one's fellow, we come to a positive act of regard for another. It's actually in the 613 commandments for the Jews, returning a lost item is both a positive commandment and it's in the list of negative, meaning to return it is positive, and to not return it, to mind one's own business, and to not take the item, whether it's an animal or a garment or anything, and to not get involved in trying to find the owner or to hold on to it until the owner comes is actually a prohibition. That is one of the negative commandments. In fact, there are two relationships to the lost property of another person. One is a prohibition on taking for present personal use a lost item, which is identifiably the property of another, and there is no evidence that the owner has despaired of recovering it, because once he has despair, then that's a different story, and then basically you are allowed to keep it, even though you know who the owner is, if you know that he had despair. The second positive relationship in connection with lost but not relinquished property, relevant here, is the question of whether one is obligated to return it to its owner. According to the first opinion, there is clearly no obligation to do so under Noahide law. You're allowed to ignore it. Just because you know whose it is, just because it has a name and an address identification, it's lost, you're not obligated to return it. We're not saying you shouldn't. We're not saying it's a proper moral thing to do, but are you actually commanded to do so? Are you actually transgressing if you don't? No, according to this opinion. It is not mandatory to expend the effort. The same applies to other cases of saving another person from material loss. For example, where the owner has a co-assignment of produce, which could rot if not sold. Selling it on the other's behalf in order to save the other from loss, for which one is entitled to claim compensation for the time and expense taken to do this. Of course, then you go to court of law, and then you have to be compensated, not only for the amount of money that you spent on it, but also for your time. Fine. But are you obligated to go through that? You're not interested. It's a headache. Go spend all that effort and that money, even though you're going to get it back. Is also a case of saving one's fellow from loss, equivalent to returning lost property, a loss to its owners. It is not evident that even the second opinion would require it in Noachide law. Nevertheless, it is within the power of societies to require finders of lost property to return it, even where the owners can be taken to have relinquished hope of recovery of it. And there is, strictly speaking, no question of keeping property which still belongs to another. So again, bottom line, it's not an obligation for you to return lost items. It's not an obligation to step in and save someone from losing their property. But if society makes that mandatory and makes that the law, then it would fall under dinim, under law and order, and it would be sort of an extension of theft, but even though it's not originally so, but it's because society has decided to do so in that particular time, in that particular locale. Fairness. Top of page 345. Fairness. Whilst the avoidance of exploitation requires a genuinely competitive market or a determination of fair margins and profits to assure both the buyer's and seller's livelihood, there is a further positive measure concerned with the protection of the livelihood of another. The notion of establishing a competitive market which removes exploitation has to be balanced by restricting ruthless forms of competition, which work actively to destroy another's livelihood, such as might be found in predatory pricing, whereby a big business undercuts a small one with prices below cost, and having destroyed the small business, reverts to higher pricing. It would appear that according to the second opinion, a prohibition on specifically defined encroachment on another's livelihood applies also in Noachide law as it does in Jewish law. Acceptance of this prohibition is not mandatory, in that baseline Noachide law is in accordance with the more minimal requirements of the first opinion. But the basic negative requirement which emerges from this topic, even according to the first opinion, is that one must not act unconsciously to undermine another's livelihood and investments. So we all know, hopefully not firsthand, but we all know that all too often you have the, whatever you want to call them, the underdog or whatever, who had a business for many, many years, or sometimes he inherited from his father and grandfather, the little friendly grocery or whatever it may be, the shoe store, the tailor, anything. And along came suddenly, right next door or down the block, the huge chain, a branch of this huge chain, and they put them out of business in no time. And in general, for the Jewish people, there are laws, and this would be under the general prohibition. It's called in Talmudic terminology, based on the verse in the written Torah, hasagas gevul, which means to take over the limit, the border. So the classical theoretical case would be that two people own property next to each other, and there's a line in between them, and one comes in the middle of the night secretly and just moves over the line an inch or so, and that is a form of stealing. So too, when you infringe on someone else's livelihood in any way, which way, that would not be allowed. So there's questions of when how can there be competition? Obviously, competition is allowed, but there are very, very specific laws as to how one can compete with someone else. And if someone has a certain store, what's the distance that the other person can open up their store? What merchandise can they sell, etc., etc. There is also a concept of moral wrong in withholding good from another where this causes no loss to oneself. There are instances when this is given in traditional sources of a person who rented a mill from his fellow in return for a rental payment of milling a certain amount of the mill owner's wheat. I'm using yours. I'm paying you to use yours. Okay, well now, what about me grinding your wheat? In the meantime, the owner of the mill acquires a second mill for himself and no longer needs the renter to mill the wheat the owner left with him. The owner would now like to have the monetary value of the milling of this quantity of wheat instead. Although technically, the renter could insist on the original terms of payment in kind, if the renter has customers for the specified quantity of milled wheat, he should give the mill owner the monetary value instead, for thereby this one, the owner, benefits, and this one, the renter, does not lose. Since the renter, in either case, mills the amount of wheat left with him by the owner, whilst it is of distinct advantage for the owner to have the money instead. Not to do this to begrudge another a benefit where one loses nothing by granting it was one of the characteristics which tradition deplores in the people of the city of Sodom in the biblical times. Okay, and it applies, this was the classical case, but it applies in any case where one person loses nothing and the other person gains. So you can't be stubborn or be mean and say, no, I don't want him to gain. We have a contract, we have a deal. If he gains and you lose nothing, it's not like, well, if he gains, I lose. No. So then it's a moral obligation. So again, for Jews, it's an absolute obligation, and they can even go to court on it, and the Jewish court will insist. Legally, they can enforce that the person has to do that which is right, because, again, to use the Talmudic terminology, it's a phrase, Ze nehene v'zeh loy chaser, which translated means this one derives pleasure, benefit, financial gain, or whatever, and this one loses nothing. Okay? The principle also applies after the event, not only before the fact, i.e., where in the first place it would have been prohibited to take this benefit. Thus, if a person dwelt, squatted on a property of another without permission, but caused no loss to the owner, now you couldn't do that. Since it was not used for rental and no damage was done, it may be inappropriate to force him to pay after the event. So someone has a vacant house, okay? And someone moved in. They did not, forget about the electricity and all the bills. Put that aside. He didn't use any electricity, didn't spend any of this person's money. He just lived in the house. The person was homeless, moved into the house, and was there for a year. The owner didn't even know about it because the owner was not renting it to anybody, did not sell it to anybody, did not use it. It was vacant. Now, you're not allowed to do that. The person who moved in transgressed. But now after the fact, now the guy moves out, or now the owner throws him out, whatever the case is. Can he charge him rent? Not so simple. It's very possible that he doesn't have to pay anything. Because it wasn't that he took away from him. It wasn't that he was renting it out and this guy didn't pay his rent. So what do you mean? I would have charged this much. You would have? Well, why didn't you? It's not like I was there, therefore you couldn't rent it out. That's a different story. If you move in and because of that, he can't put in a tenant, then of course you're causing him financial loss and you have to pay him. A person in a relationship of trust, such as a trustee or regent, where there is potential for conflict of interest, is expected to be engaged on behalf of the best interest of his or her charge and may not violate that trust. To violate trust is a level of deception, even if it does not involve outright theft. A regent may not take risks with property of orphans, because you have to be super careful with their property. Beyond not withholding a benefit upon another when there is no loss to oneself, there is a concept of positively conferring a just advantage, a fairness upon another. Such is the case in Jewish law of sale of land, where a neighbor to the land being sold is also interested to purchase it. It's a very famous case. If the neighbor to that piece of land can match the price of the buyer who is not a neighbor, the distant purchaser is removed and the land is sold to the neighbor, because there is a greater fairness in his or her having adjacent land, say for farming or to have a larger block of land for one's house. This law is not binding in Noachide law, yet it embodies an ideal based on the verse, you shall do that which is upright and good, which Noachide law can choose to adopt. Okay, and again, in Talmudic terminology, this is called in Aramaic, it's two words, bar metzra, not to be confused with bar mitzvah, nothing to do with that. It's not a 13-year-old boy. Bar metzra, which means the one of the border, the one who owns property on the border. So I have a field. You're my neighbor, you have a field. I want to sell my field. It's my field. I'm not going to infringe on your area. I could sell to whomever I want. Not so simple. If you, my neighbor, are willing to pay the price that the person I'm selling it to is going to pay, you have first choice. And again, for a Jew, this is, in a court of law, they will actually enforce it. It's not just the right thing to do, the nice thing to do, and try to convince me. That person is my friend. That my neighbor is not. Doesn't matter. I'm Jewish, he's Jewish. I have to sell it to him because I have to be fair. And he will gain much more by having this one large piece of land than buying it somewhere else. This does not apply to Noachites. However, again, as he's saying, that if they choose to adopt it in any given society at any given time and locale, then they can make it mandatory. Okay, let's open up for questions or comments or anything like that. Please, anybody.
There are lots of squatters taking over homes, right?
Where?
So, I mean, in the US, like you just see them in news, YouTube videos. They can't eject them. I mean, because the laws are very protective of them. And
Of the laws are protective of the squatters?
yes, yes. So, for example, say you went for a 2-month vacation, and then you suddenly find someone squatting. You can't actually eject him right there and then, or if he refuses. And then if you call the police, there are laws that says that you can't just eject them, something like that. Even if they cannot, even if they it's proven that he's squatting. So are those laws? I mean, they're definitely not Noahide laws, or uh,
So first of all, I was unaware. Secondly, it may not be completely against the code of the Noachites, because we need to understand why do they protect the squatters to such an extent, as you say. And as we know, that Noahide laws, as far as the commandment of dinim, of having courts of law, they have a very, very large area which they can make their own civil laws, so long as it does not go against any of the six. In other words, they can't legalize stealing. And that would be the issue here. Isn't squatting a form of stealing? So that would be the argument you have to make, explain why it's not theft. If it's theft for Noahide, not for Jews, if it's theft, then they cannot have such a law because it goes against the Torah, against their 7 laws. But so long as you can somehow make the argument that it's not theft for a Noahide, then they have range in all that whole area. I would assume that it's theft, even though, as we said, for a Jew, he wouldn't have to pay. He wouldn't have to pay for living in someone else's property. But it's still forbidden. These laws, are they according to each state, or I mean, is it?
Yeah, according to each states. Usually the liberal states usually have very strong protections for this, to the point that it's almost injustice to the legal owner. Sometimes the court case could drag on for a year, and sometimes there were victims who will hire squatters, professional squatters. So they will hire a professional squatter to squat in their house that has also a squatter, and the original squatter will get annoyed and then leave the house, and then she can finally go back to the house, something like that. So it's really messy.
Wow. I mean, I did hear that when it comes to homeowner or owners and tenants, that in many states, the tenants have tremendous rights or protection, and it's almost close. It's like almost, it seems almost impossible for the landlord to expel the tenant, even though the guy is way, way back in rent. It's like it's always in the favor of the tenant, or so it seems. But this is taking it to another level. And then you have a question: if somebody lives there long enough, can he claim that he has a right? You know, imagine somebody came into someone's home. He's there for 10 years. No one said anything to him. And now the owner says, you got to get out of my house. He says, your house, I've been living here for 10 years. So there's room to say that, you know, he may have rights, even though it's not his home, and even though he wasn't allowed to move there in the first place. But now that he's there for so long, you know, I don't know.
Challenge is that once a person establishes residency at a property, he becomes an established tenant, then it has to go through the eviction process to get him out. And that's where it becomes a challenge, because if you make it easier to evict them, then that can also affect honest tenants in other places.
Why can't the law be very clear that an honest tenant, this is a procedure, and a squatter has a totally different procedure? Why can't they just make it very clear?
Well, they're working on that. They're working on it. Yeah, they're trying to come up with ways to fix that. But it is a challenge because you're dealing with competing issues. You know, because it's all part of the tenant landlord law.
Will the new president and the new government have any thing to do with this? Will this be affecting?
It's local law, so not directly, but the tone of society right now would probably be more strict. Yeah. James has his hand up.
Right.
Hi, Rabbi Turn. Thank you. Hi, all. Shepherds. I've heard something about shepherds and these boundaries. Can you tell us more about, like, when it comes to the free market and this idea of boundaries and shepherds? I heard that shepherds sometimes get a bad rap, or they used to get a bad rap. They were considered like thieves.
So you're talking about, according to the Torah, there is such a thing that in general, the shepherds, even though it's kind of ironic because that seems to have been the profession going back from the beginning of Judaism, going back to the forefathers of the Jewish people, and then all of the sons of Jacob, all but Joseph, they were all shepherds. As a matter of fact, when they came to Egypt, Joseph told his brothers, make sure you tell Pharaoh that you're shepherds, and that's going to keep you out of slavery, and that's going to keep you out of having to be assimilated and live in the land proper, because you're shepherds and whatever. They used to worship different animals. But yeah, other than that, shepherds as a generic term, they were considered dishonest because it apparently was so easy to allow your animal to graze in someone else's field. And we do find this in the Bible, in the Chumash, going back to Abraham, and was very, very unique. And that was the difference between his shepherds and animals and those of his nephew that was with him until a certain point, Lot, that Abraham's shepherds would muzzle the sheep, muzzle the animals, so that they don't graze in other people's property. That's very unusual. Otherwise, and by the way, Moses is another one on the list. He started before his career as the Redeemer. So what he did for a living, or when he was living with his in-laws, he was a shepherd. That's how he wound up at the burning bush. Anyhow, shepherds allow their animals to graze in other people's property. And there are certain laws and certain conditions where it's permitted. There were certain conditions that Joshua made when the Jews first came and settled into the land of Israel after the 40 years of wandering during the conquest. But otherwise, if it's not explicitly permissible, that would be a big problem, that shepherds are having their animals graze in other people's property. So therefore, sometimes in the Talmud, when you want to use a terminology for someone who is possibly not trustworthy, they call them shepherds of sheep.
Oh, thank you. I want to say something really quick too. If Avraham did that with his sheep, there's something today in permaculture called mob grazing, where they have they don't necessarily make the animal hungry, but they will try to get the animal to eat in a hunger mode in a closed-in space, and it's supposed to be better for the grass and the environment and the animals in general. My point is, it seems like Avraham was onto something.
Interesting. Because the simple reason by Avram was that he didn't want to steal. But you're saying it may have been deeper than that.
Yes, it not only was it not stealing, but it was a benefit to him and his animals, like a secondary benefit.
Interesting.
It's called mob grazing and rotational grazing.
Mob grazing. Huh. Interesting. King David was a shepherd. Yeah, it seems like most of the great Jewish leaders started off their career as shepherds.
Amen.
Anyone else?
If we're dealing with the businesses that are monopolistic, or they're not, is not operating in a free market manner because of the nature of business, how are honest prices determined by the courts in order to say that they're not doing things correctly if the free market is not operating?
Could you explain? Give me examples.
Let's say somebody corners the market on green beans, and he uses that to inflate the price of the green beans. But now, how do you know what the correct price is if he cornered the market and he owns that all? You know, how do you, without a, if the free market is not operating properly, how does one determine what the correct price is if a case of exploitation is occurring?
Sounds like the same problem communism had.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the solution once you get to that point. In other words, if you have one or enough that are in on this, organized crime or what have you, at that point, I don't know how you would determine the market value, because it would become completely theoretical. This is pretty much, the what the mafia would do, just on a much bigger scale, obviously. I don't know. I don't know how it would be determined. Like, what is the court supposed to do at that point? You have to, prevent it from the very beginning. But once you get to that point, once they're able to control the market like that, what are you to do? We have so many things which obviously are way above what they really should be. It's like, if you look at it in a very, very general term, look at international. Is there enough food on the planet? Does the planet produce enough produce for all the human beings on the planet? And I think that they say absolutely, more than enough. So why are there so many people that are literally in starvation? So that's because of the distribution, and that's because of the corruption of the market, et cetera, et cetera. So people can't afford certain things. But really, as far as supply and demand goes, we're not talking about gold. We're talking about produce. So there really is enough for everyone. And it's just that, it got so out of hand, and this is where we're at.
Rabbi, related to that, there was this news a few years ago that really disturbed me. Because of prices, the farmers just threw their milk, because the prices were so low. So if they also start selling what they harvested, the milk, it will go even down. So what they do was just they were throwing gallons, hundreds of gallons of milk, lots of producers, farmers, and I thought, oh, what a waste.
Can you blame them? Can you blame them?
Yeah, I mean, can't they? I don't know, donate it somewhere? I don't know.
That would defeat the purpose. I'm not saying that what they did was the right thing to do, but
Yes,
they need to make a profit. They need to have enough money to be able to buy meat, to be able to have what they need, and they can't because there's so much of it. So why should they suffer? I understand it sounds so cruel, such a waste.
yeah.
But again, the problem is because there isn't proper distribution. They have bills they got to pay. They have things they have to spend their money on. And if they're going to sell their milk, instead of this and this amount per quart or per gallon or whatever, they're going to sell it 50% of that or even less. Then they have no livelihood. So what choice do they have? I mean, it seems very sad that they resort to that, but you can see it from their perspective. It's not like they were trying to overcharge. Unfortunately, we hear too often where there's cases where it's because they want to overcharge, and then therefore they don't allow, people to get what they need because they want to make it, a commodity that's so necessary and there isn't enough of.
James.
Thank you.
Thank you. Back to Bob's point. I know back in communism, well, I shouldn't say back, but in communism, they have to rely on the free markets. They would use the centralized system and peg to the free market, or try to. And I'm wondering, I think we talked about DOS here, like knowledge of both parties have to have knowledge of a fair price. And if you can't
agree, but they have to agree to it.
Right, and agree. So wouldn't they be under coercion by the government, maybe? Like this is almost like a systemic issue with under that. I don't know, it's just my thoughts.
Yeah, I hear. The question is, to what extent do the lawmakers of the time and the place have free reign? To what extent? Right. They can't legalize stealing, murder, adultery. Okay, well then, when you speak about theft, what's called theft and what isn't? That's the question. So if it's intrinsically, by definition, stealing, they can't allow it. But as long as it's not, then it may be wrong for doing it. It may be not the right idea in the spirit of the law, but they probably do have a right to do it as long as it's not legally, for a noachide, considered stealing by definition, such as taking someone else's property without permission.
Is that kind of like, let's say you live in a completely communistic society where they take everything and you have to rely on the government for your bread because they take 100% of everything you have, and you have to rely on their handouts. How does that work? Is that considered a dina de malkusa dina, or is that considered theft?
I'm not sure, but I would lean to think that it's more like theft, even though you can make the argument and say, 1 second, whatever you own is yours and people can't take it from you. What makes it yours? How do you own it? You live in a country that they own everything. You know what I'm saying? It's like, let's say in the United States, do you own your property? You pay taxes on property taxes, but do you own the property?
I would say that I'm a steward of that property, but yes, like legally.
So you legally own the property.
I legally do. In a spiritual manner, or honestly a real manner, I'd say I'm a steward of it if it came down to it. But because Hashem ultimately owns it, but at the same time, legally, it would technically be mine.
And not the government's.
Correct.
You're entitled to it.
What was that?
You have a title to it, but it's all through the government. It's all how the government divided it.
In other words, you're saying that really it's owned by this body called the government, which came here, and without getting into the whole controversial of how they in the first place took it over from whoever was here before, but let's say 1776, let's just say that's the year where it became owned by the body which governs the entire United States, or whatever, let's just simplify it. Okay, so now it's owned by the government, but they allow people privately to own real estate, to have property, but it's all under the government. So who's the real owner?
Well, it depends on how you understand the concept of title.
Right. Okay. And the same thing with if it's it's a monarchy. So the king owns everything. It's his country, and all of the citizens have certain rights granted by the king. And depending on the level of how it works, he could at any given time, I guess, take away someone's rights to their own property. So they don't really own it. When you have title of a car, that's where common folk use the term title, right? You have title of your car. What does that mean? You're not renting it, you're not leasing it. You have title. So what does that mean? That means you're the owner. And which means that you have every right to use it in any way you want as long as you don't harm anyone else. You still have laws that you have to abide by how you use your car in public. You can't speed, even though it's your car, but that's completely different. That's because of endangering people. But it's your car. Can you take your car and break it into pieces and sell the pieces? Yes. No law can tell you you can't do it. It's your car. You have full ownership of it. It's the same thing with property. I would think that as long as it doesn't harm the neighbors, the society, the country, I can't just drill and do whatever I want on my property without, or for example, there are safety codes. So legally, you can't do any type of construction in your house as you see fit. But I mean, it's my house, and I don't have any tenants. I live in my house alone. It's my house. Why is it illegal for me to, renovate in a certain way in my house? Because it's not safe, and therefore they step. But it's not that they have ownership of it. Just like the car, they can tell you you have to drive in such and such a way, or you must wear a seatbelt, even though it's your car. You have title, same thing, but it doesn't take away from the fact that you're the complete owner. I don't know.
That's very interesting.
Just thinking out loud, like what really does it mean, to be the owner of something? Just like if you own an animal, you can't abuse it. It's that simple,
I think maybe it comes down ultimately to Shem owns everything. Even a king can get rid of his kingdom. His kingdom can fall.
Right. So anything we own is only because Hashem gives us those rights. But now we want to understand what exactly is the framework of those rights. He owns everything, and he created everything, and he put us here, and he says, you now have rights, and here's how it works. And you now have ownership. And therefore, no one can come along and steal someone else's property and say, well, Hashem is the owner of everything, so it's not really yours, so that's why I took it. So what gave you a right to take it?
Right.
So it's all within this framework of what are the divine rules and laws of ownership and of buying and selling and transferring, ownership, etc. Anyway, any thoughts about what we should use, what we should learn from after we finish this book? Has anyone given it more thought? I've been looking a little bit into the Sheva Mitzvahs Hashem, and it's definitely written for Jews, but it's really, but for that matter, so are pretty much any original writings, unlike what's being written now specifically for the Noachide, such as the book that we're using, or Rabbi Weiner's the code, but otherwise anything that we're going to find in the original was obviously written for the Jewish people. So that's the tone of it, but it goes through a lot, much of which we have discussed and learned, but it's pretty thorough and it's very systematic, and he goes through so many mitzvahs and discusses, does this apply to Noachide or not? And, brings the sources and on and on and on. But I don't know. I don't know if that's what we want to do. That's what I've been looking over here lately, but open
It
to
would be a
any.
major undertaking, but if you're up to it, I'd be very excited about it.
You mean to translate it as we spoke about?
The way, the way you've done some classes in the past where you read it inside, translate, and then discuss it.
Yeah, I agree with Bob. I do like that. I'd also be interested in what the others say about it as well. But I do like that method of teaching that you have.
Okay. But then the question is, how do we transcribe it? That's the next stage.
What do you mean transcribe?
Write it, to have it, typed up.
We would open up a Google Docs file that
Okay.
we all would have access to, that we would all be able to edit. And
Okay.
then maybe throughout the week, we listen over the class and we all, we corroborate, we collaborate and edit it. Whoever at their own leisure can do it. But like
Okay.
Google Docs, you can type while others are typing too, so it happens
Right.
live, which is cool.
Right. You mentioned that last week. Okay. We still have a couple weeks to think about it. If anyone else has something that they really feel very strongly about, please let us know so we can make an executive decision.
Yeah, for the other people in the class, be aware that this book, it is available. I don't know how many are available in the pipeline in the United States for people to buy, but it is available in a couple bookstores. One I put in the chat. It's also available in Greenfield bookstore out of Florida, but it's entirely in Hebrew. So
Do you know the price offhand?
the one I bought out of New York, that was $20 plus another about another $9. So it was a little less than $29, including shipping.
Now, it has here two New York addresses where it's available. One is a P.O. box in Muncie, New York, and the other is in Brooklyn, New York. That's, well, I don't know if it's actually if we're saying, it says if you have any comments, these are the addresses to go to.
Also, it's available on HebrewBooks.org. It appears to be a 2-volume set. I assume it's the same book. You saw it, James. I assume it's the same book that we're looking at.
Yeah, we're talking about volume 2. Not that you'd be able to buy volume 2 without volume 1, but we're talking about actually part 3 of them, which would be, I guess, the second half of volume 2.
No, I'm sorry, you guys lost me. I bought just one book. It's there's maybe three. It looks like there's 3 sections or 3 books in the one physical book. Is that what you're referring to? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I found on HebrewBooks.org seemed to be a volume 1 and volume 2, but without having the physical book, I can't tell what it is that I'm looking at to compare. Okay, so that's what we're looking. I'm going to turn off the YouTube now and.
Okay.